All right, I think people are just arriving in now, so why don't we get started? So welcome to everyone who's joining now to the WeAreVirtual webinar that I'm very pleased to contribute to on leadership in a crisis. My name is Justine Lutterodt and I am director of the Center for Synchronous Leadership. We are a think tank, a membership organization, and a consultancy. We've been going since 2010, and we specialize in working with corporate change makers and looking at systemic change in the corporate sector. We actually started off our organization in a crisis, and back then it was just me. So we're in a crisis now, a different type of crisis, but actually it's familiar terrain, and I think that it will also be relevant for some of the insights that I have to bring to the table today. Today, we're going to leave a little bit of room for it to be interactive. I really want to know what some of the questions are that you have and what's going on for you, so that we can have some sort of tailored points in addition to some of the general points. I can't cover everything on this topic, obviously, but I've focused in on a few things that I think will be useful and that I see across the board. So hopefully you can take something away, and then we're going to leave a little bit of space for those of you who have specific questions that hopefully I can answer. In terms of what we do and sort of what the Center for Synchronous Leadership is, a lot of work that I do is coaching at the top of organizations and working with people who are running it, their teams, helping them sort of anticipate and stay in tune strategically and culturally with their organization. We also run programs for people navigating their way through the hierarchy and coming into their leadership potential. And we do larger series that are sort of open to broader audiences under the banner of A Step Ahead. So now, why don't we get started here? Let's see. There we go. The tightrope of leadership. So I would describe the journey of being a leader very much as a tightrope. And by that, I don't just mean balance in terms of finding compromise, but there are often tensions that you have to reconcile that are part of what it means to be a good leader. So for instance, what is in your interest versus what is in the members of your team's interest? What is in your team's interest versus other teams or the larger organization? These are very real tensions that people have to reconcile when they're in a leadership position. Also, what is the sort of strategic imperative versus what is good for the culture? What is the thing that will bring profit versus what is, the thing that sort of has an ethical component, whether it's inclusion, mental health, sustainability. So these are tensions that you have to reconcile. And at the heart of a lot of these tensions is a balance between short-term and long-term. And so there is a time horizon aspect that affects a lot of the challenges that we face as leaders anyways, and is sort of always in the background of many of the tensions that we feel. And so that's relevant because when you are in a crisis situation, it can feel like you're walking a different tightrope, and that instead of having this, security of knowing that I could only fall a few feet down, and I sort of am figuring out how to do this, but there's only so far I can fall, and I think I know how to do it. Now, all of a sudden, you can fall down much further. The stakes are raised, and also you don't know when it's going to end, so you can't really see what's coming. It's a regular feature, but in a crisis, it's particularly acute. So there's an uncertainty. All of that tends to cause different reactions in different people. So you have lack of choice. You didn't ask for this situation. Sometimes you'll take on a project, or you'll be really excited about a big role that will stretch you and you choose it, or it knocks on your door and you say yes. But a crisis is not something that you ask for. So that's often relevant to how we respond to it. It's unfamiliar. It's territory that you haven't been in before, so you don't have the answers. And there's pressure because the stakes are often higher. All of this converges to produce fear. And fear is very important as a feature in a crisis, Because if you were to think about things that we call a crisis versus things that we don't call a crisis, often it's about our level of fear. For instance, in the case of COVID, when I've spoken to some of my friends who are in China, they find it very interesting that we had the luxury here in the UK of seeing what had happened to them, and yet we weren't in crisis mode. We could see what was coming, but we didn't consider it a crisis. We didn't consider it a crisis until it was close enough in our minds that we could be afraid enough that we could freak out. And so at that point, it's a crisis. So the fear is relevant both for defining what is a crisis and also for how you manage that fear, which is a key characteristic in whether you'll be able to lead effectively during a crisis. So I'm now going to explore that a little more and focus on 3 aspects of decision-making that can get distorted because of this fear. And some of this distortion is based on different personalities and how you, just what you're more prone to. And other aspects of it are based on the scenario and sort of where you are in coming to terms with the crisis itself. So let me explain. So the first one I want to talk about is avoidance of responsibility. And you'll see in this picture that this guy is looking the other direction, very close to the water, and there are sharks swimming around. And that sort of, you know, sometimes is intentional, sometimes it's not intentional. You're just not looking. You don't have your eyes, you know, looking wide enough and broad enough, and you miss something that could, you know, could become a very big problem. But initially, the sort of response is, I'll just move this box here, is I'm focused on something else. So the reason why, you know, this isn't a crisis, or the reason why I'm not taking responsibility and coming up with a plan is I'm just focused on something else. However, at some point, you see the thing and you can't really make it out, and then you can make it out, but maybe it's not a big deal. But maybe if it is a big deal, it's not my responsibility. And if it is your responsibility, then maybe I'll get around to it. And if you are going to get around to it, or if you don't get around to it, all of a sudden it becomes a problem. Holy crap. And so there's a version of this which, you know, we see play out on the political spectrum in terms of the US's response and Brazil's response to COVID-19, and sort of looking at what was happening and saying, you know, it's probably just like the flu, it's just some sniffles, it's fake news. And then before you know it, you know, it's Chinese problem, it's not a problem over here. And then all of a sudden there's a real problem. So this is the avoidance of responsibility. But when we see leaders do it, it can feel really frustrating, but we all do versions of it. And I saw this happening in terms of clients and, you know, how quickly they were responding to the need to move from working in the office to working at home. Some were way ahead of the game, and others were very reluctant to make that move because they just couldn't imagine it. They were very attached to the idea of working in an office, and because of their attachment to that idea, it was very difficult to imagine not working in an office. And so they didn't imagine it. And then they found themselves in a situation where they had no choice and they hadn't taken the time to imagine it. So they sort of end up in a worse position. So avoidance of responsibility is something that you sort of want to pretend it's not coming. It comes anyways, and then you have a problem, something that we often do. But when you see that something is a problem, you run into this, which is decision paralysis, which is, oh gosh, this is an important decision. I can now tell that it's important. It's now big in my mind. So now I'm focused on it. And in fact, I'm so focused on it, and I really, really can see how important it is, and I want to get it right. And so in this scenario, you're trying to get it right. You're trying to get it perfect. You can see how this could go wrong and that could go wrong. You're trying to optimize, and you're trying to optimize to a degree that is not realistic given the time that you have, or in such a way that you will never get there. And so this desire to get it perfect, or to at least get it to a certain level, results in you not being able to get it to the level that you could have gotten it to. So it goes from this is an important decision to, oh, I don't know how to do this. I'm not equipped. This is unknown to me. I need more information. And then it's still, I have information. It's not 100% clear. I can't make a good decision, and then holy crap. So, you know, you delay. And there are micro versions of this, which many of you may relate to. I know for myself, sometimes there's a challenging email that I need to write or respond to, and I sort of feel like I want to get it perfectly right. I want it to be really smooth. I want it to express something very clearly. And in the delaying of expressing that thing perfectly, I lose the ability to actually do it in a way that would make it much easier. So by the time I write it, I have to write a different email. So that is a common thing that I experience, but we all have versions of this where we delay because we want to get it right, not because we're in denial. So it's a different thing. Also, we saw this in terms of what was happening, again, with COVID. We saw this play out on a larger scale with some of the European governments in terms of wanting to get it right, understanding the seriousness of putting people in a lockdown scenario, and therefore really hesitating to do it despite the scientific evidence. So then let's move to the third one, reckless action. So this is in some ways the counterpoint to decision paralysis. And this is when you can see that there's danger, but your initial response is to act. So we're in danger. We need to act now. And that sort of we need to act now fills your head. And then, you know, what can we do? And you just look around, what can we do? And you do that. Let's do that. So you do the first thing that comes to your mind. You do the first thing you can think of. Really, you're trying to regain a sense of control. And so you impulsively do the first thing that you can think of, imperfectly, no time to think, there is no time, panic, and holy crap, it isn't quite right, and you screw things up further. So this is reckless action, and there are versions of this. I can't think of an example at the moment in terms of how this is played out in COVID in a sort of governmental leadership, but we can see the panic buying that many of us did initially was a form of this, which is, oh shoot, what can I do? I'll just do this. And you do it too much. You're not really thinking, what do I need here? And you might actually do something which sabotages your ability to act. So mindless action. So all of these three things, avoidance of responsibility, decision paralysis, reckless action, these are things that it's easy to look up and see other people doing and to see the impact that it's having, but they're all stuff that we do. And one of the really important things to notice is to just call out when you do it and to make it acceptable to actually call out when you do it. Because the power in being able to make better decision-making in a crisis is to notice when you're getting into compulsive fear-based patterns like this. And all of these things would be reasonable under the right conditions. So let's just run through what's driving them. In the case of avoidance of responsibility, people are focused. They're either focused or they're happy with the way things are, and they don't want to disrupt things. They don't want to lose that focus. They don't want to take on one thing and drop the ball in another thing. And so this fear of disruption is partly what drives the avoidance of responsibility. Ironically, the fear of disruption, when it is fear-based and compulsive, often leads to greater disruption because you lose the ability to respond to the thing that is actually happening, whether you like it or not. So fear of disruption actually leads you to have greater disruption. Fear of failure is often what's driving the analysis and the sort of, I can't move, I really, really want to get it right. So that analysis paralysis is often driven by a fear of failure. Again, ironically, because you aren't going to be able to get it perfectly right with time constraints, the fear of failure or right go down. And then reckless action, when you do something impulsively without that time to think, you can easily, it's driven by the fear of losing control, the desire for control, but that fear-based mindless action can lead you to have less control. So the irony here is that without that space to really stop, notice what's driving you and work it through, you actually end up having a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fear actually manifests the thing that you're trying to avoid. And this is classic in terms of how you see people reacting. I've seen it play out with clients during this period. My clients specifically have done pretty well because they have built that sort of muscle of stopping and looking at what they're doing, but they've seen it play out in their organizations of people panicking and just wanting to do something and doing the wrong thing, of people sort of wanting to get it something perfect and sitting on it and missing the time horizon that would have given them an edge. So there's a lot of this going on right now, and I guess some of you will relate to it yourself, and others will be able to see it in others. Now, what is the antidote to each of these things? For fear of disruption, the antidote is partly detachment. Often people are so attached to the way things are. So you saw this with the office moves. People who, or companies where they hadn't really explored flexible working before, and they didn't really think it was possible. And so they were delaying as much as possible, or they were hoping it was just going to be this really small temporary thing. And they weren't detached enough from their way of doing things to be open that there might be another reality that they would have to adjust to. I saw this uh, in our case, because a lot of our was in person. In fact, all of our offering was in person. We didn't do online stuff. It was, sort of a signature of us that everything was in person. And so very quickly we had to detach from a whole lineup of things that we had in person and come to terms with the fact that nothing was going to be in person, and really see that that wasn't going to change for an extended period of time. So detachment and tuning in and really being able to notice the signals. What I'll also point out here is that some companies had been in tune with this trend before this crisis happened. So flexible working is one of these things which has been a trend. There has been a demand for it, there's been an interest. And some companies have been attuned to that and receptive to it. And as a result, they've experimented and explored and have been more in a better position to be able to adjust. So in terms of fear of failure, one of the things that's really important here is having a growth mindset, being able to understand that part of what you're going to gain isn't the perfect answer, but the learning from it, and that putting out your best and realizing that that's, you're never going to achieve perfection, but in doing your best, you're actually building a muscle. That approach and that sort of level of expectation of yourself, that I'm going to do my best and I'm going to learn from it, creates a very different and a smoother experience for you and your team. It makes it easier not to get paralyzed by fear. Second here is experimentation. So when you are afraid of getting it wrong because you don't have enough information, the sooner you see that, the sooner you can begin doing discrete experiments. And again, I'm going to stick to the example of flexible working, because what I saw some clients do is I saw some of them see that this might be happening a couple months in advance, and actually taking parts of their workforce and having them work from home for a period of time to just experiment, try it out, get them set up. The ones that were forward thinking enough to just try this out and experiment because they saw what might be coming were in a completely different place. This was an extremely smooth transition for them. So the act of experimenting is always helpful when you can do it, but the earlier you do it, the better. And so instead of being paralyzed, you can take a discrete part of whatever decision you're making and try something out, and try it out in a way that you'll get quick feedback. That is also key. Fear of losing control. One thing that's really helpful here is to just come to terms with what you have control over and what you don't have control over very quickly. So what can I do? What can I control? What can't I control? We see this in terms of how people are adapting to the working from home environment, which is one of the key features and challenges that people are facing right now. All of a sudden, there are not the normal cues that you have in your professional environment to signal that now I'm in working mode. And for some people, that makes it hard for them to be in working mode. For many people, that makes them hard for them to not be in working mode. And it's very hard for them to switch off or take breaks or anything like that. And so one thing that some of our clients are finding helpful is actually dressing up professionally or doing something to signal that they are now in a professional mode. And so that they can control. They can't create the office environment. Some people are starting to transition back now, but what they could do is change their clothes or work out something in their immediate environment such that they could create a protected space and some boundaries. So what can you control? What can't you control? Otherwise, the risk is that you put impulsive, reactive effort into something that you actually wasted from that. And during a crisis, you only have so much energy. Energy is a very important thing to pay attention to for you and for your team. And then evaluation of options. Obviously, doing something reactive, you're not having the time to think it through and what are your options. So A common theme in all of these is the space, the mental space to really pause and tune in to, what's going on for me? Am I doing this compulsively? Hold on. What's required right now? And detach, tune in, experiment, understand what you can control before you act. Depending on what level of crisis you're in, sometimes this will just be 5 seconds that you have. Other times this will be 5 hours that you have. So obviously you can't always make 5 hours or 5 days or whatever. The time horizon will vary. But what I can assure you is that if you take the appropriate amount of time, you will end up making time. And if you act compulsively, you will end up losing time. It's like running, trying to get somewhere and running off in the wrong direction and then realizing, I've actually done this actually, I'm realizing you're going in the wrong direction. And then, it taking a lot longer to get to your destination. Another thing I'll point out before moving on from this slide is that this is a metaphor for what happens when we're in any type of crisis. If all of a sudden you find flight, freeze, or fight, that is sort of on an animal level how we're programmed. And so the avoidance is almost like you're running away from the situation. Decision paralysis is a form of freeze, and reckless action is a form of fight. And that's important to call out because these are deeply programmed reactions. And so some of you will have a tendency towards one of these more than another. And it's totally fine that that's your reaction. It's more of understanding it and being able to slow it down so that it doesn't hijack your decision making. So I'm now going to sort of talk about muscles, because I remember I had the opportunity to speak to and interview someone who was an ultra marathon, a very successful ultra marathon runner. And I find myself very intimidated by the idea of marathons. So I was really curious as to how he thinks about ultra marathons, prepares for them. And one tip that he provided was that many people show up at a marathon and they think it's about running the marathon and having the willpower to run the marathon, having the strength, the resilience to run the marathon. And they don't realize that before the marathon, a serious marathon runner will have invested in having a different body. They will have built different muscles. They will have built different mental muscles, particularly for ultra marathons. So they will have, conditioned themselves to, go without food and sort of see what that's like until that becomes more normal. And so it's important to call out that some people have stronger muscles when it comes to crisis than others. And if you know that about yourself, you can have a bit of empathy and really work with where you are so that you can get to the next level. If you don't recognize that, you might try to push yourself in a way that you just don't have the programming yet to do. Just like if you run a marathon and you injure yourself. And also on your team, there are going to be people who have never faced a crisis and people who were born into crisis. So people will have different responses, and it's not always something that they can suck up because they have different muscles that have been built to a different extent. So understanding where you are, where people in your team are, is relevant here. And going back to this prior slide, a lot of stuff that I'm listing out here is stuff that you get better with over time. So being able to switch from one thing you're focused on and one reality that you thought was going to happen to another one very quickly. That is, for me, for instance, that's a skill that I had to develop when I started off in the middle of a crisis as an entrepreneur, which made it much easier for me to adapt during this period. Other people who have never had that experience will be struggling to build that muscle. And it's important to just understand, where you are, where people on your team are, and what assets they have to bring to the table. The same with experimentation. Some people are comfortable with it. Others are used to just following rules. In terms of taking courageous action, taking considered action, people will have different strengths and different muscles that they've built. And if you can understand those, you can leverage them collectively on your team to have a better outcome. Getting a step ahead of the crisis. So one of the things that you'll notice is that time and space is a feature of what will allow you to respond better. And that's key because this is a sustained crisis that we're in right now. And so we're not just in the crisis of today, we're in the crisis of a month from now and the crisis of 2 months from now. And how we respond to the crisis of today whether that is in terms of, clients, in terms of your organization's profitability, in terms of whether your job and your role exists, whether you're going to have the same size team or not. Whatever the crisis of today is, how you respond to that will determine the level of crisis you have a month from now. And, as we just talked about in the beginning, if you can see that crisis coming, you have much more scope to actually shape what happens a month from now than you do to shape what happens today. And so getting a step ahead of the crisis is partly about doing all the things we've talked about, and I'm going to run through them, but it's also being able to anticipate what's coming next so that you can actually shape the next crisis in a way that you have more control over. So one of the themes that I've mentioned is mindfulness and the ability to really take a step back, see what's happening, tune into your environment, tune into yourself, tune into the people around you, and slow it down. See what the fear levels are, lower them. A nice metaphor for this is if you think of that tightrope sort of going over those buildings, lower that tightrope so that it's just a foot off the ground. It's the same skills needed to balance yourself on it, but one has a lot of fear associated with it, the other one doesn't. So mindfulness, a lot of people find meditation practice to be useful in helping them to just calm their reactivity right now. But calm their reactivity while still recognizing what is happening and still staying quite tuned in. Focus is more important than ever. And so this is a good time for those of you who aren't sure what your values are, what your vision are, to really reflect on that a little bit if you can, because that's what guides you, that's what guides your team. What is the purpose that is guiding your business? What is the thing that should be prioritized above all else? And what are the values that you want people to remember you for? Because after this crisis, people are going to remember you for your actions, behaviors during the crisis, people in your organization and your clients. Energy is a key thing to watch. Sometimes people who are used to pushing through are used to operating based on willpower and grit. But grit only takes you so far. And if you aren't aware of your energy levels, if you aren't investing in your sleep, if you aren't actually making it as easy as possible for yourself to have energy, taking breaks, there are things that you can do to optimize your energy. And it's really important right now that you do those. What are you eating? Simple stuff. What is your routine? Are you getting outside? And these are things that people sometimes, they have so much grit, they don't have time for them, but they won't actually be at their best. They won't be able to optimize their performance otherwise. Resourcefulness. You're being asked to face situations you haven't faced before. You're asking people on your team to face situations they haven't faced before. So you're going to have to be creative, come up with stuff, make lemonade out of lemons in some cases. And that requires you to be in a place where you can think creatively, where you can think flexibly. And so when you're under huge pressure, it's hard to do. It's just like for people who are afraid of public speaking, when you're speaking in front of 10,000 people, it's very different from if you're speaking to your friend. You can think of things in the moment, whereas you might clam up in another context. And so being able to, again, lower your anxiety levels, access your resourcefulness is really key for responding to stuff creatively in the moment, improvising. Team alignment, very critical. People who have invested in their teams and their relationships before this are finding it a lot easier. But those who haven't, this is an opportunity to do that, because otherwise, people who have had a system of command and control where they sort of micromanage are finding it really challenging to do that. And it can lead them to want to micromanage even more, which is a mistake right now. Instead, it's actually investing in the relationships, building up trust, being very clear in your communication so that people understand the challenges that you're facing. And there can be a shared understanding that's honest and transparent. Agility, very important. And I don't just mean agility in a generic way. I partly mean the ability to tune in and anticipate what's going to happen next so you can begin to prepare your response, and the ability to sort of switch gears. So these are muscles that become really important right now and which will help you beyond a period of crisis. So really important ones to build. Learning, sometimes people are too busy responding to crisis to learn. Teams that have regular feedback right now are able to learn a lot faster. And it's a classic mistake as a leader that you're relying completely on yourself and you're not able to tap into the resourcefulness of your team. It's only through a regular practice of, reflecting on your learnings that you can get smarter in terms of how to deal with this period. And so learning as a practice right now is important. And then the amount of time will vary based on what you have available. And design. People who are responding and they're in respond mode can sometimes miss that you have the opportunity to invite yourself to a new future, to invite your team, your clients to a new future. And it's not just based on the circumstances and what's been done to you. It's also based on the opportunities that those present. And that involves really thinking creatively about, okay, what do I have now? And, what have I lost? And how could I recreate that in a different way? What have I realized that I need that I didn't know before? I'm hearing a lot of clients say that they missed their commute. Their commute gave them that chance to pause and also get ready for work, get in work mode. And now some of them have designed the equivalent into their day in a way that works for them. So they've sort of set aside time to go for a walk or do something that allows them to get that same thing in an even better way. So design, social time, we now no longer have organic. You don't bump into someone online in the same way. And so people realize that's something I've lost. How can I design a version of this that does that? It may not be better, it might be different, better in some ways, worse in others. So being proactive and thinking about how you can design the right experience flips it a little bit in terms of how positive you can engage, how positively you're engaging with the situation. And it gives you a boost of energy during this period as well to feel like you're moving to something better. So just looking at the time, I'm going to switch to questions in a moment. I'm going to just make 2 points here. One is what I call the diversity advantage. Some people are in crisis mode and they don't have time for diversity right now. And I think this is a classic example of a mistake, because those who have valued diversity and those who have been different have an advantage right now. In order to know what's going to happen next, you have to be tuned in, and people who have different ways of tuning in are going to pick up on signals that they would otherwise miss. So having a sort of diversity of radar, diversity of perspective, diversity of people who you're plugged into, because it's really hard to meet new people during this period, gives you a distinct advantage. We have certainly used that ourselves. We are plugged into a very diverse group of leaders, different sectors, different backgrounds, and we had to pause because all of our in-person stuff was canceled. And we went through a consultation with, our diverse set of, in fact, it's not just the leaders, we mentor some university students, and we have a spectrum of people, social entrepreneurs who we support as a consultancy and a think tank. And so tuning into them has given us insight way beyond what we'd have otherwise. And that insight is a huge edge right now in terms of knowing what will happen next. And it's given us this distinct advantage. The second part of the diversity advantage is that if you have been the different one, and you've had to adjust to a norm, it's going to be easier for you to adjust to this norm. If you have made an effort to accommodate diverse interests beforehand, if you've had someone who, because of a disability, had to work from home because they were in a different country, and you've accommodated that, some of the stuff around remote working is going to be very easy for you. So there is an advantage in really challenging yourself to step up to what's required to manage a diverse team, and an advantage that will come with that right now. And this is the image I want to leave you with, which is in leading right now, in thinking about yourself and your own career, and thinking about your team and thinking about your organization. This is the metaphor that was a sort of a guiding metaphor for me, because I sort of was just looking at what's happening to the economy and all the businesses that are challenged right now, and thinking, how do we stay in the best position possible? How do our clients stay in the best position possible? And you'll see that if you're a hand soap company, you're doing very well right now. Your business is increased, and unlike toilet paper, it's not a temporary thing that people will just get over. It's going to continue to do well because people now have a habit that is related to the crisis we're in of washing their hands. And so if you can position yourself as hand soap, if you can figure out what your strengths are, what your purpose is, what's needed in society, what's needed in your business, and sort of tune in enough to understand how you can best serve right now and align that with your career, align that with profit, then you are going to stay relevant. And that is something that I know is a source of anxiety for many people right now. So I'm going to stop there.